Hi, my name is Ben Dyer, and today we're going to be covering Colgan Air 3407 and the accident with this flight that took the lives of 49 people, all passengers and crew on board, as well as one person on the ground in a home. So today we're going to look at an accident overview real quick, or we're going to look at some details of what was going on. We're going to look at the captain, first officer flight training experience, the flight records, the aircraft itself, its condition, some causal factors, influencing factors, the NTSB results, their findings, recommendations they came up with, as well as my personal recommendations and how I view this, and what we can maybe learn from it, as well as a little bit of a biblical viewpoint on it. So first, real quick accident overview. So flight accident and background information. So obviously this was Colgan Air flight, scheduled air carrier flight. It was at night, pretty late at night. They took off about 9:20 at night. I'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. But it was a little bit of a later night flight. The weather conditions were not great. It was about an hour-long flight. They were going into Kabuff, and they departed from Newark, New Jersey, WR, I believe is the identifier for that airport. So there's a little bit of background information on the flight itself. So probable cause initially, we'll talk about this more later, obviously, but pilot error for the most part. They did not recover from the stall that this aircraft got in due to icing. And contributing factors, pretty simple as far as contributing factors go, but we'll get more into it later, obviously. But weather's going to be one, and the pilots are going to be one, and their handling of the aircraft. So some details of the accident, real quick. Let's talk about what was going on the flight, kind of the timing of it, so we know where we're at in the flight and kind of the steps that took place. So the aircraft took off about 21:20 in the evening. They were cruising. I got cruising altitude about 21:35. Something to note is the cockpit voice recorder picked up the sound of a yawn or something like that from the captain. So that could be an indication that he was getting tired, getting a little sleepy, something like that. At about 21:50, they started to brief their airspeeds for their approach at 21:53, and they started their approach briefing into Buffalo at just after 10 o'clock at 22:04. And at 22:12, they start talking about the ice buildup that they're experiencing with the aircraft. And then something concerning right after that cockpit voice recorder picks up, and we can read in the report, is the pilots continue on to another conversation that does not relate to the flight. It doesn't say what that conversation was, obviously, but it was not related to the flight, and they were in one of the critical phases of the flight, so they were breaking the stereo cockpit rule, and they're obviously below 10,000 feet, most likely at that point. At 22:16, captain calls for gear. They start getting the flaps configured, getting the speed. And at that point, they get the ice detection alert. The stick shaker starts shaking. Again, an alert for a stall. Autopilot disconnects, trying to get their attention to react to this stall. And those alerts and warnings continue until the aircraft does inevitably crash. So flight environment, covered it a little bit. It's not great weather conditions at night. It's winter, and there's icing, low clouds, and decently windy. Aircraft condition, however, aircraft is, besides having ice on it, mechanically, the aircraft is working as it should. We'll talk about the aircraft maintenance and its condition a little more later on, but the aircraft's in good condition. And let's note, though, the pilot monitoring, the pilot flying, the captain was, in fact, the pilot flying, while the first officer was the pilot monitoring. So let's go over corporate provided training. So what training the pilots got from the company itself when they got their job and their initial training. So obviously, flight training got their initial training. As far as stall training goes, specifically to stall training, they did get additional stall training in their sim sessions. Something to note, though, is they did not get explicit training on recoveries from a full stall in the aircraft. Most of these stalls, where they were approaching the stall, they were getting low on airspeed, but the aircraft had not actually fully stalled. So they weren't exactly or particularly trained on recovering from a complete stall of the aircraft. They did get some additional winter operations training related to winter weather operations and conditions. This included some things like anti-icing procedures, additional checks to make on the aircraft, and some responsibilities and looking out for any contaminants on the wings, such as ice or frost. These are a little more geared towards the pre-flight, but also just keeping in mind those additional responsibilities that the flight crew has during winter operations, and be a little more vigilant. So another one we got is a crew resource management training. All their crews had a additional crew resource management training. Um, Consisted of an 8-hour long class, as well as some recurrent 2-hour classes. We can read in the report for crew resource management. Obviously, crew resource management is a big factor related in this accident, and it could have been prevented probably with better crew resource management. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the last one here for this is a captain's leadership training, specifically for captains. They get a 1-day training course specifically for them as they transition and move into the captain's seat, and the additional responsibilities that they have, including administrative tasks, but as well as they're now the leader of the flight crew, and they need to act accordingly, and there's additional tasks for them to perform in that regards. So let's talk specifically about the captain's flight experience. So he had 111 hours in this aircraft, in the Q400, and only 38 hours of actual instrument time. So he certainly had more simulated instrument time in the simulators, but with only 38 hours of actual instrument time at the time of this accident. Obviously, they were in good IMC conditions on this flight and during this approach. So that's a big contributing factor. Personally, when I was doing my instrument training last year and starting to fly in the clouds, there's a big difference between simulated and actual. Even if you do get up to 38 hours, there's still not a lot of actual instrument hours or time in the aircraft for that matter. So some activities prior to the accident the captain was doing was he was very busy with dealing with the personal related items and company related items and activities, and he was not getting the 8 hours of uninterrupted rest prior to the flight that is required for fatigue management. So that's something to keep in mind. So he was tired. Again, we remember a little bit after cruise, before the landing, the cockpit voice recorder picked up something that heard like a yawn. So he was certainly getting tired or getting close. So for some training difficulties, some training problems that he had during his training throughout his career was one of the Czech airmen noted that he had difficulty using the flight management system, or the FMS, in this aircraft, which does relate to controlling the aircraft speeds or selecting the speeds and speed management, telling the pilots what speed they need to use for the conditions, their flap settings and approach speeds. So that's something to keep in mind. However, he was pilot flying, so odds are the pilot monitoring was in control of that. But that's just something to keep in mind. But overall, he was a fairly good pilot overall, very focused, very confident in his ability to fly. And that's what most of the Czech airmen that he flew with mentioned, was he was a very good overall pilot. And he did have a total of 3,051 hours in turbine aircraft, which is something to mention there. So the first officer's flight records, some of their experience, they had 774 hours in this aircraft, which is quite a lot actually for this one aircraft, especially his first officer. But they only had 6 hours of actual IMC time. So again, another situation here, we can see neither of them had a lot of actual instrument time. We can note before employment with Colgan here, it does mention she did have 86 hours of simulator. I guess that also goes for the actual instrument. It was 6 hours, so they probably picked up more. It doesn't mention exactly how much they had at the time of the accident, but they did have 6 hours of actual and the 86 hours of simulated before their career started with this airline. Something to note is when they went for their first officer went for their CFI certificate, they did actually get a disapproval on their first attempt. Some areas that need to be worked on mentioned were performance maneuvers and flight pre-flight procedures, and even basic takeoffs and landings and go-arounds. So they did have a disapproval there on their flight instructor certificate. That's just something to keep in mind. Some activities prior to this flight and prior to this accident the first officer was involved in. They had just completed a 5-day trip that ended there in New Jersey in EWR Echo Whiskey Romeo. And they didn't get a lot of good sleep or certainly any kind of good rest as they had to commute. And they were in Seattle, and they got aboard a cargo flight as a jump seat passenger. However, the flight crew of that aircraft did mention that she was awake, seemed alert and everything, and she was fine at that time, so there's no concern at that point when they talked to that other flight crew that she flew with when she was just a jump seat passenger moving from airport to airport, getting to where she needed to go. And throughout the report, we read that she did get some sleep intermittently here and there, not any kind of good sleep in a bed or anything, but on the flight she got about 90 minutes. The flight crew said, and as well as in the flight crew room at one of the airports, slept on a couch for a little bit, but that doesn't really match up to getting good sleep in a bed as far as how that rest relates to you. Specifically, stall training that this first officer had. As they were an instructor, they were flying a PA-28 Archer, Piper Archer, and they had obviously done many stalls. It says 600, anywhere to 1,000 stalls. So certainly lots of stalls, lots of practice on those. But the thing there with that is recovering from a stall in something like a Piper Archer or a light aircraft is going to be different, and it mentions that it's in contrast with the stall recovery procedures for this aircraft, this larger aircraft, turbine aircraft, and the procedure for recovering as far as when you retract the flaps. As in the larger aircraft, it was a coordinated maneuver, as states, retracting the flaps as well as or better to say, she was not actually the one who recovered or brought the flaps up, as it was a combined effort, you could say a little bit more. So aircraft maintenance. Let's talk briefly about the stall systems, the ice detection systems, and the maintenance records of the aircraft and its condition. So as far as stall protection for this aircraft, we talked a little bit about the stick shaker system to alert you to a stall, alert the pilot to the stall, as well as the stick pusher to kind of push the nose over a little bit, try and get the pilots to react again, something to get their attention. So there's those couple of items. There's also for the ice detection, talk about that. Mentions the best way detecting ice is still by looking out the window and looking at the wing, which is obviously true. That's better than any kind of system you could implement, is just by using your eyes. But there are ice probe sensors, and it does send a signal to the avionics in the cockpit, which gives them an alert, which they did get. They did get the ice detected alert, and those probes are mounted on the fuselage, on the forward part of the fuselage. As far as the aircraft maintenance records go, specifically for the day of the accident, the aircraft had actually undergone 2 line checks. The only problem they found, and they fixed that problem, was the right side detector probe for ice was not working or malfunctioning or something, and they did in fact replace that, and they ran tests on it, and those tests met standards, so there was no problem there. So the aircraft was in great condition mechanically, so there are no concerns whether or not the aircraft was fit to fly. So, causal factors, some influencing factors related to this flight and related to the accident here. So, meteorological conditions obviously were not good. The crew awareness was down for sure. I'll talk about that a little more. And the company's policies and procedures could have been better in places. They also weren't followed precisely. So, firstly, meteorological conditions. We've talked about that as winter weather. The visibility is 3 miles. The clouds are about 1,000. There were another layer 2. And it was overcast at 2,700. Temperature was 1 degree Celsius. There was reports of light snow and mist, as well as some pyreps of light to moderate rime ice, even from 3,000 to 14,000 feet, which is a very good segment of their approach phase. So picking up lots of ice potentially, which we know did in fact happen. The crew awareness and situational awareness of the crew was not as high as it should have been. Obviously, this is a very critical phase of flight, and even more so in these conditions, it's very important to stay aware of what's going on and stay focused. We know they were not following the sterile cockpit procedures. This kind of goes into the company policies and procedures section a little more. They kind of go together. But they were not following that procedure and they got distracted, and definitely not a good situation. I got decreased situational awareness going on. And they're talking about something else in the cockpit that's not related to the flight, and they got the situation building and not in good weather conditions. So the NTSB's results, probable causes to say for this accident. They did not respond to the stall warning horn or the multiple stall warning alerts that the aircraft was giving them, whether it's a stick shaker or the push of the yoke forward, or even they should notice the fuel of the aircraft, pitching up of the aircraft. They should have been able to see that on their primary flight display, as well as their ground speed. If they were even looking at that as something they could have noticed. And we also mentioned they did have the autopilot disconnect go off, and eventually, obviously, they tried to recover from it, but they were unsuccessful. The stall got too far, and the ice built up. Failure to monitor airspeed, obviously one of them. The airspeed got too low. They weren't paying attention. Kind of goes into the stable cockpit, and they were not paying attention to what was going on with the aircraft. Should always be paying attention to what's going on with the aircraft and staying ahead of it. But even more when we're in these kind of weather conditions, and we know they weren't super experienced in actual IMC conditions. So that could be a contributing factor. Hard to say exactly how many hours they may have had at that point, actual instrument time combined. But that's certainly a big one, the way I see it, keeping sterile cockpit procedures and the company procedures. So this certainly relates to not following sterile cockpit, sure, but also a fatigue management as well as a airspeed selection for different conditions, and especially icing conditions, and keeping the icing conditions in mind when they're selecting their airspeeds for their approaches. And I also mentioned in the company's training for the flight crews that they did not fully prepare the crew for recovering the aircraft from a full stall situation. The aircraft was fully stalled. They had primarily only trained on recoveries when the stall speed was approaching, their airspeed was getting low, but they had not actually fully stalled the aircraft. So there's just a few things to keep in mind as far as some of their findings and probable causes. A very long list of them, but those are some of the most predominant that I picked out. Some recommendations the NTSB made following this accident to help prevent future ones is additional stall awareness. So things to help flight crews be more aware of stalls. So one of them would be the airspeed indicator, color coded in a way you could call it. It kind of gives a low speed hue, they call it as well. And it changes from a white color, airspeed being a white, transitions to yellow and generally red or amber or something like that, trying to get your attention more to what your airspeed is. Another one is going to be leadership training, obviously, for even both of them, in my opinion, but certainly the captain. Um, Being more professional in the cockpit, stereo cockpit, again, correctiveness, ability to stay focused for both of them, keep your crew focused on what's going on with the flight. They could talk after the flight if they wanted. Fatigue awareness, big one for both of them, even. The first officer didn't get a lot of sleep or good sleep. They had just completed a pretty long trip and they were commuting to their next flight before this flight, and this was a bit of a later night flight as well. And they had woke up about 9 or 10 in the morning. We can see that in the report. So fatigue awareness, big one. Obviously, we also heard the pilot voice recorder yawn there. We know he was busy as well the previous part of the day and night and didn't get a lot of sleep. So fatigue awareness is a big one. Assurance programs. These can be used to collect flight data and help the company identify areas where flight crews may need to get additional training in those areas, just to kind of help prevent any future accidents, or they're making a mistake in a certain area of the flight or on certain parts. They can get some additional training on those and just get some corrective action. And so, personal recommendations, kind of start summing it up. Situational awareness, I talked about it. Big one. Keep situational awareness at all times, even in everyday life. It's certainly a big one that we should be working towards. Kind of applying a worldview there, biblical worldview. Adherence to procedures, definitely a big one. Big one in my flight school is following the procedures. They're there for a reason. Generally, again, something like this happens that implements these new procedures and previous procedures even. So they're there for a reason. We should be looking to follow them. They're there to keep us safe, even if they may not be the most convenient to us, like something on stereo cockpit. When I talk about something, but we should be following the procedures and recognizing distractions. So being able to not only work to not get distracted, but recognize it when you are distracted so you can take corrective action before you get too far down the road and something like this happens and you're unable to recover. So 2 Timothy 2:15, work hard so you can represent or present yourself and to God and receive his approval. So we're not just working for the company, we're not just working for ourselves, we're doing whatever we do, we should do it all for God. And remember that, sure, we all fly in this aircraft, but we also got the lives of a lot of people on board, however many it was. In this case, 49 people, as well as the lives of people on the ground. Thankfully, not too many lives on the ground were lost, but certainly could have been prevented still with some better management of things. But that's going to wrap it up for this accident report here, Colgan Air 3407, and thank you.